Glad you're here tonight. We are in the book of Ruth. If you want to turn there, you can. We are going to pick up with verse number 6. We're in the book of Ruth. We're going to pick up with verse 6. And we're going to go through a couple of verses tonight. And as you're turning there, we'll have a prayer in just a moment. But just a quick backdrop as the crisis kind of just falls onto Naomi. Even though I'm just putting Naomi's just name on there for the sake of space, just assume Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah, excuse me. Knew it was going to happen. There we go. Orpah, I'm combining everybody because they suffer the same thing. So when I single out Naomi, it's not just in terms of singling out. We will be able to put her under microscope. So the way that this outline, if you can kind of think of it, is Naomi's going to have her time to speak. Then Ruth is going to speak, and then Naomi's going to speak again. And so they're going to take turns, if you will, in the spotlight, for lack of a better way of putting it. As we read this, one of the hardest things to do with our Old Testaments is to overlay the New Testament on top of them. It's especially with Naomi, who is struggling mightily with loss. And we would say, well, where's her faith? You know, Ruth is stronger and deeper in her faith, and here's Naomi, and she isn't. We need to give some graciousness to this because everybody's going to respond to grief differently. Naomi doesn't lose faith, but faith does get overshadowed. And she does get on the verge of bitterness. So while we may say to embrace the grief in the sense that it is a real, raw emotion, we need to be careful that it doesn't consume us. And Naomi kind of teeter-totters, if you will, on that line. And we're going to talk about this tonight and then, next week if that's what we need to do. But as we read through this in just a few minutes after the prayer, I just want you to see this exchange that takes place in Naomi and Ruth and everything that goes from there. And we'll ask some questions on that. Let's have a quick word of prayer and then we'll get started. Father, you bless us in so many different ways, and for that we're thankful. We're thankful for the class time that we have and the mutual study that we're about to undertake when it comes to the book of Ruth. Father, as we examine the conversation and the almost the begging and the pleading of Naomi as she deals with her loss of turning her daughters-in-law back, we pray, Father, that we will glean the lessons for ourselves because it will be only a matter of time for any of us in this life when we encounter loss, whether it's our loss or someone else that is very close to us who suffers loss themselves. We pray, Father, that we will be able to emulate Ruth and even more than that, Jesus himself, as he walks by those and with those who go through their pain, their grief, their sorrow. We pray, Father, for your blessing as we study your written word, and the blessing being not just simply to gain knowledge, but to grow and to expand our faith and to be pleasing and honoring and glorifying you in every way that we possibly can. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. All right, let's pick up with verse number 6. We'll read down to verse 15. Then she, that is Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt kindly with me, dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each one of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in the womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." So just a couple of questions. Recap, just kind of wake us up a little bit at the end of probably a long day for a lot of us. How does Naomi's life unravel? And again, I'm lumping in Ruth and I'm lumping in Orpah here, but how do their lives unravel? What happens? All three men die. Within a span of at least a minimum, I remind us of this, of a minimum of 10 years, three men. You got husband, two sons, two husbands. That it just unravels. The unspeakable happens. It isn't just one death. Now it's three. And within a decade, you're burying them. If you're Naomi, you're burying all of them. And of course, Ruth and Orpah are there too. So what are they at risk now? Now that all of that's happened, they're dead, they're buried. What are the risks? What's facing them?
Going hungry.
Okay, going hungry. Okay, perhaps. Okay, so perhaps at the moment they are in the fields of Moab, but immediate future, that who knows how long. So if you didn't hear what Tom said, they are going to be dependent. So going hungry, but then they're going to be dependent on the benevolence or the kindness of whomever it may be that they come across. Yes, ma'am.
Personal safety.
Okay.
In that time period, women were safe because they were protected by the men of their household. They don't have to.
Okay. So you've got personal safety at stake here, and they are protected as long as your husband or even your sons. Right. If there's a male figure, ideally relative, a male relative, you are protected. Physically, you are protected. And of course, there's other ways as well, but you are certainly protected. What else are the risks that are facing them? Okay, lack of an advocate. That's a great point because there is no voice. And we kind of look at it and say in Israel, but in the ancient Near East in general, women just did not have this. So if you hear what Stan had to say, an advocate, somebody who would go for them, somebody who would speak up for them. There's nobody, at this moment, there's nobody like that. Any other risks that you can think of that are facing them? Ma'am? Okay, so we've talked about food, we've talked about benevolence, but if you need to hear Pam, money. Money still matters then. Some sort of coinage, some sort of bartering, something that exists within Moab, they still don't have it. They still, because who is normally the one that goes to work in that time? Okay, so the husband, father, brother, uncle, somebody, even if they could take him under the wing. So even if Elimelech passes, and he did prior to his sons, most likely the sons assume the role and take care of their mother. So that is financial. We're looking at safety. We're looking at food. What else? Any other risk that you can think of facing these women at this particular moment? Okay. Okay, so from a woman perspective, specific to Naomi, if you didn't hear what Anne-Marie had to say, she's not a suitable marrying individual. It's not like there's going to be anybody that's going to look at her and say, the prospects of marriage and marriage with you specifically are still there. That's not there for her. So if you didn't hear Anne-Marie specific, there's still a hope, if you will, for Ruth, for Orpah. But Naomi, she's past childbearing years, would be the assumption, would be the guess. Now, obviously, the Lord can do whatever. We know what He did with Sarah. But under normal circumstances, she's past childbearing years. If you cannot produce children in the ancient Near East, what value do you have to anything as a woman? Okay, so David?
So it just made me think of something. So these two women were married for 10 years to these Israelite guys, and they didn't have any kids.
At least, yes. Yes.
At least 10.
Yes. Yes.
At least 10.
No children, correct.
So is that because they were Moabite women?
We don't know. We haven't.
10 years, no kids. That women here that had sons that were married and waited 10 years and didn't have grandchildren would be having a cow.
Yes.
Grandchildren have a cow.
Yeah. But you make a good point. So on one hand, we don't know. The text is just absolutely silent why there are no children or grandchildren. We just don't know. But the other is, because of that, though, that the future, not just of the family, but of the community. Israel, we just know this from Israel, when a child is born, the celebration isn't a few days. There isn't we're going to have a baby shower, we're going to celebrate for a few hours, and then we're all going to go our way. The local villages and the communities, they celebrate weddings for at least a week. They celebrate the birth of children because it guarantees, at the moment, it guarantees there's a future for this. So the risk that all the family is facing in general at this moment, because there are no children, is that the family's going to be gone. The family's going to be lost. There is no one to carry on this specific family name. And they are possibly facing that. So Scott, go ahead.
At least in Ruth's case, I think you could make a case that it was providential she didn't have children. Because if she had had children, how easy would it have been for her to leave Moab and go back?
Yeah. And that is a possibility. That it is that having children, and it would have been half Moabite, would have been the chances of staying home, staying close to family, and women being able to do that. That is a good point. That is a possibility. Go ahead.
There is a decent chance that Naomi knows when she goes back to Judah, she will get her land back.
It's a possibility.
As a word, with the heritage system they have.
Yeah.
What are these women who are not of Israel, who are not of the family, not of the bloodline, going to lay claim on as soon as Naomi dies?
That's true. They have nothing. You're absolutely right. And Naomi, maybe perhaps, and we would seem indicative of this, of what Ruth does when she just stays in the corners of the field, that there's at least a working knowledge of the Torah, of the law. So it is very possible when she hears this that she's going to go back and be able to reclaim or have the chance of reclaiming in the year of Jubilee, when everything goes back to its original owners and back to its original family. So that would be one of the reasons why she goes. But if you didn't hear what he had to say, even if she does, and the daughters-in-law go, they're not guaranteed because there's no male heir for this. Because that's the way it works. So
Could be that the sons buried late in the 10 years,
it's possible.
and they might have been sickly in the late of the 10 years.
That is a very real possibility, because if you're growing up under a famine, you are going to be malnourished. You're going to suffer malnutrition. Your body's just going to be less than what it is as a physical side of things. So you've got to, that's a real possibility as well. Go ahead. Okay, so again, housing, either if she stays, because you assume housing there in Moab, or housing back, you're still having upkeep and you're having all of these things. The point in this exercise was, this isn't Naomi, Ruth, Orpah, your family passes, let's go down to the Social Security office and get survivor benefits. That doesn't exist. There is no, let's go down and enroll you into welfare, let's go down and enroll you into Medicare, let's go down and make sure you have all that you need. That system does not exist. And when whatever your thoughts of the American system, that is a very fortunate thing that exists within this country. Now, one way or the other, whatever your thoughts are, just saying that in general. Now, it may not be run like it's originally supposed to be. That's worth discussion. But just in general, there is no such thing in Moab or in Israel that says, let's take your Social Security card, let's take your marriage license, let's take your identification, let's get you enrolled, and let's make sure you're taken care of. And there is no nursing home, there is no assisted living, there is nothing. So you mentioned this. It isn't going to be just financial benefit and financial benevolence. Who's going to, from a safety perspective, who's going to take them into their home? What guarantee do they have that whatever housing they have, that some individual isn't going to come and just take it because they are vulnerable? Go ahead.
We're not Jewish law requiring the brother-in-law to take over his.
We'll get there. We'll get there, but that won't be tonight. I mean, that will be later with Boaz, later in the book. But yes, ideally that would be the case. But if both brothers, both brothers already died, that's it. That's it. Both brothers are gone. So that again, what God had provided as we would say as a cushion, that's gone too within the framework of the law. They are behind everything that you could possibly imagine, and they are at risk at a lot of things. So. What does Naomi hear while they're in the fields of Moab? According to the text, what does she hear? Okay, which is fascinating. That's the first time the Lord's mentioned. He visited his people with food, which tells you what in the land of Israel? Based on what you know of the book of Judges, what's probably happened? Okay, so whomever the judge was, we don't have that, but whomever the judge was came. The people repented. God raised up the judge, delivered them, and has ended the famine. So the discipline is ended. So if we're going to go home, now's the time. And to David, that's your point. Maybe this is our chance. This is the opportunity. So her decision, let's go home. She hadn't been home at a minimum. She has not been home in a decade. At a maximum, she hadn't been home in 40 years. Because remember, the cycle within the time of the judges is that Israel would be in captivity for 40. So you're looking at somewhere between 1 decade to 4. That's a lot of time in regards to that. Yes, sir. It is, which is what Anne-Marie had pointed out. Naomi doesn't have prospects. There is nothing specifically for her, which is going to play a role in why she uses the word bitter. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, with all of this said, and David, you kind of touched on one point, but I want to do a couple of things. What does Naomi encourage Orpah and Ruth to do? Okay, go back home. She tells both of them, want you to go back home. Go ahead, David. Okay, that's the other thing that's mentioned. Not just home, but God's. Go ahead. Yes, to the mother's house. Yeah. So there may be something that maybe there is not a male figure. We don't know. But Moabite culture is not going to be like, to a certain extent, like Israelite culture. So what are some of the things that she says? And there's an exchange. Naomi speaks, the daughters-in-law respond. Naomi speaks, the daughters-in-law respond. Naomi speaks. So 3 different times Naomi tells her daughters-in-law to go home. What are some of the things that you see for her? If you're Naomi, you're seeing Naomi. What does she use as a justification to encourage them to go home? What are some of the things that she says? Okay. All right. So she understands. She admits, I don't have anybody. So I'm not going to bear sons. I'm not going to do any of that. So the best chance for you, girls, is for you to go back home. And why would going back home help them the most in terms of remarriage? What does that do? Okay. Okay. So what is the likelihood of another Israelite man in Israel marrying a Moabite? Next to 0, most likely. So let's increase your chances. So this isn't her saying she doesn't have faith. This is her looking out for him. It's a form of taking care of them. I can't do much for you, but what I can do is provide you. She's doing what we call emancipation. I'm freeing you. Go back to your family. But I want you to do so because that's going to increase your prospects of marriage. And notice again, marriage guarantees them, or at least assumes that. Okay? Go ahead. I would, yes. I would say that is something you need to stick because we're going to need to look at this. You need to stick on the wall because we're going to revisit it. And the reason being I say this because we talked about this some last week as a possibility. Who's the one that came up with the idea to leave Israel in the first place? Elimelech. But where did he go? Remember, we talked about making decisions. What factors did he employ to make a decision? And who was ultimately the one that made it? Himself. Now, I'm not saying again that that's a guarantee. I'm not saying that that's what happened. We got to acknowledge that it's a possibility. But if it's a possibility, where did Naomi learn to be the solution to the problem? Oh, I blame the husband. Not that one. I was just saying that she learned to look at herself for the solution to the problem, right? Which is, this isn't about right or wrong. This is just the fact that it's very possible. What I do know, and this is a tail end of last week, is that the temptation to solve your problem is you. And that's not the way that the decision-making of the follower of God is supposed to be. You and I are not smart enough to solve all of our problems. But we are tempted to be the one to solve it. Now, again, that's just kind of going there, but that's where we were last week in that. So, David, you make a good point. So what are some other things that Naomi says to encourage them to go back? Go ahead. Okay, again, I have nothing for you. I can't give you sons. So even if you thought, well, one day you will marry, this is Naomi, to her daughters-in-law. Even if you think one day I'll remarry and I'll have sons, are you really going to wait around until they're 15, 17, 20? Right. So, I mean, are you really going to wait around and do that? Are you really going to do whatever it is that you want to, in that regard? What else do you see her using to encourage them to go back? Ma'am? Okay, she does lean in her own understanding. Perhaps she does that. Go ahead.
God in the world is against her and has been against her, so you can stick with me, it's all going to be bad for you.
Yes.
Go find something where you can get better.
Yes, so I'm glad you brought that up because verse 13, look at what she says, and this is giving us it's an indicator of what's coming from Naomi. Would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? Notice what she says here. No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake. It doesn't translate well into English in just about any version, but the idiom is, everything that's happened has made me too bitter. I'm not good for you. I'm not good. I am not. So this kind of the idea, David, I think is what you're alluding to. I can't not just physically be there for you, but I can't right now. Right or wrong is to the periphery at the moment. She's acknowledging, I am not mentally and emotionally what you need, because they're suffering loss too. We can't forget them. Even though they're not, it's about Naomi. This has happened, and it's the first time she lays it at the Lord's feet. The Lord has gone out against me. Right or wrong, the second time the name of the Lord is mentioned is in a negative. It's in a negative. The first time is a positive. The Lord visited his people. But Naomi specifically, when he quote-unquote visited me, it was against me. Now, this isn't right or wrong. This isn't healthy or unhealthy. This is just a person being honest. And we need to be able to look at that. But David, you're on to something with that. I can't be what you need, even if it's an emotional stability type place. Anything else that comes to mind? Jeff?
Naomi is personally experiencing being a widow in a foreign country away from her family. When she goes back to Judah, if her daughters-in-law come with her, that's what they're going to do.
They are. It's very possible that if you come with me, you will be at risk there because you're not welcome. Remember, we did this. Moses specifically says in Deuteronomy, you don't let them in. How is she going to show up 10 years later, not just with 2 Moabite women, but 2 Moabite daughters-in-law? They're put in a different kind of risk. So all of these things we kind of look at, and sometimes it's framed as, well, Naomi doesn't believe, Naomi this, Naomi that. Everything but perhaps the one thing that we were talking about just a second ago, David, everything's coming from a good place for them. Now, we're not talking about whether it's wise or not. It's just coming from a good place because she sees this. The one thing that is interesting is at the end of verse 15, what David said earlier. See, Orpah has gone back to her family and to her gods. That's significant. Why do you think that's significant? Why is that a significant phrase? It's possible with Shamash that there's equality. Okay. So going back with her family, she has more of a chance to be accepted. It's just interesting, though, that for the very last conversation before Ruth interjects, Naomi says, look at your sister-in-law. She's going back to her family and her gods. What's significant about that? So equality may be one. What else? It's a test. Go ahead.
It's a test to see if Orpah has enough of belief to brave that move.
And here's so there, and I agree. So we'll go through multiple layers of this. You've been married 10 years to an Israelite husband. Do you think you've learned anything about Yahweh? Decision or not, let's just put that to the side. You have at least learned anything? You think you've been told the story of Exodus? At least 10 times, right? At least because of Passover. Whether they kept it there or traveled back, we don't know any of that. But one way or the other, Passover, at least for this family, is a very real possibility of being kept. So at least one time a year, you've been introduced. If you're Ruth, if you're Orpah, you've been introduced to Yahweh. So from a test perspective, this is, what are you going to do? And did the gods ever go away? This is just something to consider. I'm not saying, again, this is just something, cards on the table. What's going on? And there's a contrast now between Orpah and Ruth. And it's possible that they encountered all the same rituals, all the same stories, all the same things. And when the test comes and the opportunity to exit stage right is provided, will you go back to where you came from? Will you fall back into a default pattern? Or will you move forward? Go ahead, David. It's a possibility. Go ahead.
Now I see why you guys said it's a test. But in verse 15, Naomi says, return after your sister-in-law.
Yes.
I think it's a test for Naomi.
Not just a test, I think it's more of a revealing for Naomi.
Well, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more, but you're still onto something. What's happened in Moab? And this is the implication of the decision. This going back next week. This is the implication of the decision. What do you think has happened in the 10 years from a religious and spiritual perspective to Naomi? If she says, not just to her gods, but I want you to go essentially do the same thing she's doing. What's happened? Nothing. Go ahead.
She's saying that God has left me, and maybe you'll be better off to get out from under the influence or the degradation that I'm having.
Okay, so worst case scenario, absolute worst case scenario, following Yahweh, believing Yahweh hasn't amounted to anything. At the least amount of worst case scenario, the first command, you don't have any other gods before me, equal to David, your point in terms of equality. You going to be 10 years in a foreign land and not be influenced by the practices of everybody around you? Do you know the first person who makes a monumental decision to move himself and his family to a specific place based on good land, good farmland, good healthy land? But the text says he was close to 2 cities. Do you remember him? Lot. Here's the thing about decision making. I'm not saying when I say this, predict the future. But the proverb writer will say that the prudent sees danger when it's coming, and he ducks his head. You got to have enough foresight that when you're standing at the crossroads of a decision, if I make this decision, where could this potentially lead me? Lot? Do you think Lot thought anything that Sodom and Gomorrah were going to turn into what they did and do to his family what it did and ultimately result in the loss of his wife? No. He made his decision on, when Abraham gave it to him, choose. I want that. He said, it looks good. Nothing wrong. We're not talking about right or wrong. Sometimes the wisdom that is needed in the conversation before you make the decision is, if we make this decision as a family, if we make this decision as a husband and wife, if I make this decision as an individual, where will this possibly lead me? I can't predict it, so I'm not going to say this will happen. But we've been around the block enough, the majority of us in this room, there ought to be enough foresight to be able to say, this probably increases the chances for at least blank. So is it possible that when Elimelech and all of them make this decision 10 years prior, that there is nothing on the table that says, but if we do this, Naomi, I'm thinking about leaving. I hear that Moab's got plenty of food. We can take our boys, we can get them healthier, we can take care of our family, and we'll return at a later date. Naomi, what do you think? You know what? I think that sounds good because we got to do something. We talked about this. Was there anybody that stopped and said, however, we go to Moab, we do stand to increase the chances of exposure to blank? Did anybody say that? I don't know, but that's the lesson for you. When you're sitting at the table, when you're looking down the path of your life, and you're a parent, your husband, your wife, when did you sit down and say, let's just pretend we make that decision. Let's just pretend for a moment. What happens? What happens? When did we do that last time? See, that's the inherent danger of us putting ourselves in a position to where we got to make it. And our society is about impulse buys. The worst purchase is an impulse purchase. All I'm asking for all of us is a measure of wisdom that says, if we make this decision, what happens? If we make this decision, what's likely to happen? If we make this decision for our family, and we put our kids in this school, or we put our kids in that school, or we allow them to do this, or we allow them to do that, or, hey, you know what? We're going to change jobs because there's more money. It's great. What is that decision going to likely imply? Bigger house? More upkeep? The list goes on, right? That's the idea. I'm not saying that's, again, I'm not trying to cast stones on them. But 10 years later, go back home. Ruth, she went home. She went home to her family. That's great. And to her gods. And to her gods. Very quickly, David. Yeah. Now, that's a lesson for us. That's just kind of assuming a lot. Were you raising your hand? Go ahead, Scott.
I just want to add, though, and I'm not taking anything away from what you said, but the Bible is full of the story of God working out His plan, even when His children make stupid decisions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's an added blessing, that though we do our best, we're going to be imperfect. God still works out His plan.
You got it in my lesson next week. Because yes. Because the tension being created in all with the discussion of providence, because we're working under a non-miraculous version of this for a moment, is that exactly. Is the fact that God will work in that. That's the Romans 8:28, that he will work all things for good. The extreme of that is I'm just going to keep on making dumb decision after dumb decision, and he'll continue to work it out, right? And what needs to happen is that there needs to be a collective aspect of wisdom. So I'm going to leave you with this because we need to get into this next week. Ruth's got a decision now. Orpah's made hers. Naomi's made hers. Ruth comes in. So she's got a decision. Does she go back to family? And we need to emphasize again, to God's as well. Okay, that's a package deal. Or does she stay with Naomi? But if she stays with Naomi, there are some things that that come with that. She got to follow Yahweh. If she leaves, there's no going back. There's no going back to family. She's got to go to a foreign land where she's not welcome. She's not welcome. And she has an imperfect faith modeled by Naomi. She doesn't have a father. She doesn't have a brother. She doesn't have a husband. And I'm not saying they would be perfect either. But what Naomi is about to reveal about herself is going to tell you from a faith perspective what Ruth is going to have to draw on. And this isn't to kick dirt on Naomi. I've already mentioned Naomi is not lost faith. She's struggling, but she has not lost it. But Ruth is still going to have that as a model. Okay? And there are a lot of us who look at other people and say that because their faith was imperfect, I'm not going to believe anymore. And you know what's amazing about Ruth? Is that all of this, she takes it, but most importantly, she looks at Naomi, as imperfect as she is, and doesn't lose her faith. This is why your faith is built on God and not others. This is why others are supposed to be a supplement. But we cannot make decisions of faith based on somebody's imperfection. And yet there are a lot of people who are jaded with Christianity because they have looked at the imperfection of other Christians and have decided that they can't do X, Y, and Z. That can't happen either. Because the thing is if you're looking for the perfect model, there's only one, and he's in heaven. But he's revealed in the book. So I know you know the decision. But for the next 6-7 days, Lord willing, I want you to sit with this. And you are Ruth. And you got to make a decision. You stay or you go. And what does that look like? You've got to have foresight. So the class is yours. Thank you for being here.